What you're about to hear is a tale so terrifying, so steeped in musical damnation and supernatural horror, that it has echoed through the streets of Tremé for over a century. This is not merely another legend whispered in the jazz clubs of New Orleans, this is the documented account of 17 musicians who gathered at a crossroads where earthly talent met infernal power, where the price of musical perfection was paid in souls, and where the very foundations of what would become jazz music were forged in the fires of hell itself. This is the true story of the Devil's Crossroads in Tremé, and the night when 17 souls traded their humanity for the ability to make music that could move heaven and earth. The year was 1888, and the Tremé district stood as the beating heart of African American culture in New Orleans, a place where the musical traditions of Africa, the Caribbean, and the American South converged in ways that would soon give birth to an entirely new form of artistic expression. In this neighborhood of shotgun houses and corner groceries, where the descendants of freed slaves had built a vibrant community despite the crushing weight of post-Reconstruction oppression, music served not merely as entertainment but as a form of spiritual resistance that connected the living to their ancestors and to powers that transcended earthly understanding. The crossroads of Ursulines and North Robertson streets had been considered sacred ground by practitioners of voodoo and hoodoo since the earliest days of the colony, a place where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds were thin enough to allow communication with entities that existed beyond normal human perception. Local residents knew to avoid the intersection after midnight, when strange lights could be seen dancing in the air and the sound of otherworldly music drifted through the darkness like smoke from an invisible fire. It was here, at this supernatural nexus, that 17 of the most talented musicians in New Orleans found themselves gathered on the night of October 31, 1888, All Hallows' Eve, each drawn by dreams and visions that had promised them the opportunity to achieve musical perfection beyond anything that mortal hands could create. They had come from different backgrounds and musical traditions, but they shared a common hunger for artistic excellence that had consumed their lives and left them willing to risk everything for the chance to transcend the limitations of human ability. Among the 17 musicians was Jelly Roll Morton, born Ferdinand Joseph Lamotte, a young Creole pianist whose innovative approach to ragtime was already beginning to hint at the revolutionary musical form that would later be called jazz. At just 18 years of age, Morton possessed a natural talent that exceeded that of musicians twice his age, but he was tormented by visions of musical possibilities that seemed to exist just beyond his reach, melodies and harmonies that he could hear in his dreams but could never quite reproduce when he sat down at the piano. Also present was Buddy Bolden, a cornet player whose powerful, emotional style had already begun to attract attention throughout the African American community of New Orleans. Bolden's music seemed to channel the pain and joy of his people with an intensity that left audiences weeping or dancing with equal fervor, but he knew that his current abilities were only a pale reflection of the musical power that he sensed waiting to be unleashed within him. The gathering included Sidney Bechet, a young clarinet prodigy whose technical skill was already legendary among local musicians, and King Oliver, a cornet player whose innovative use of mutes and special effects had begun to expand the expressive possibilities of brass instruments. These men would later become legends in the history of jazz music, but on that Halloween night in 1888, they were simply desperate artists seeking a way to break through the barriers that limited their creative potential. The other 13 musicians represented a cross-section of New Orleans' musical community, including street performers who played for coins on Royal Street, church organists who had been trained in classical European traditions, and folk musicians who preserved the African rhythms and melodies that had been brought to America by their enslaved ancestors. Despite their different backgrounds, they all shared the same burning desire to create music that could touch the divine and transform the souls of those who heard it. The entity that had summoned them to the crossroads was known in Louisiana folklore by many names: Papa Legba, the Crossroads Devil, or simply the Music Man, but regardless of the title used, he represented the same fundamental force, a supernatural being who controlled access to artistic inspiration and who could grant extraordinary abilities to those willing to pay his price. According to the traditions passed down through generations of musicians, this entity appeared at sacred crossroads on certain nights of the year, offering bargains that could transform ordinary performers into artists of legendary skill. The appearance of the Music Man at the stroke of midnight was heralded by phenomena that defied rational explanation, as the very air around the crossroads began to shimmer with supernatural energy while the temperature dropped to levels that made the musician's breath visible in the humid Louisiana night. Street lamps flickered and dimmed, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources, while the sound of distant music began to drift through the darkness from directions that contained no visible musicians. The entity that materialized before the 17 musicians was a figure of terrible beauty and otherworldly power, appearing sometimes as an elegant gentleman in a perfectly tailored suit and sometimes as a more primal force that seemed to be composed of pure musical energy. His voice, when he spoke, carried harmonics that resonated in frequencies that human ears were not designed to perceive, creating melodies that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the deepest levels of the musicians' souls. The Music Man's offer was both simple and terrifying in its implications. He would grant each musician the ability to play their instruments with supernatural skill, to create music that could heal the sick, drive listeners to ecstasy, or even raise the dead, but in exchange, they would surrender their souls to his service for all eternity. The bargain would take effect immediately, transforming them into musical instruments of divine power, but the price would be collected upon their deaths, when their spirits would be bound to serve the Music Man's purposes in whatever realm he inhabited. The decision that each musician faced was complicated by the knowledge that their enhanced abilities would not only benefit themselves but would also serve their community, as their supernatural music could provide healing, inspiration, and spiritual uplift to people who had been denied such gifts by the racist society that surrounded them. The Music Man emphasized that their sacrifice would help preserve and transform the musical traditions of their ancestors, creating new forms of artistic expression that would influence human culture for generations to come. Jelly Roll Morton was the first to accept the Music Man's bargain, stepping forward to place his hands on the supernatural entity's shoulders while speaking the words of agreement that would bind his soul to eternal service. The transformation that followed was both beautiful and terrifying, as Morton's fingers began to glow with an inner light while his consciousness expanded to encompass musical possibilities that had previously been beyond human comprehension. Buddy Bolden followed Morton's example, accepting the supernatural bargain despite his understanding of its ultimate cost. The moment his agreement was sealed, his cornet began to emit sounds that seemed to contain the entire emotional spectrum of human experience, from the deepest sorrow to the most transcendent joy. The other musicians could feel the power radiating from Bolden's instrument. A musical force that seemed capable of reshaping reality itself through the sheer intensity of its artistic expression. One by one, the remaining 15 musicians stepped forward to accept the Music Man's offer, each transformation adding to the supernatural symphony that was beginning to fill the air around the Crossroads. Sidney Bechet's clarinet began to produce melodies that seemed to tell the stories of every soul who had ever lived, while King Oliver's cornet created harmonies that bridged the gap between earthly music and celestial song. The collective transformation of the 17 musicians created a supernatural orchestra whose combined power exceeded anything that had ever existed in the mortal world. Their music began to attract spirits from across the city, as the ghosts of deceased musicians, dancers, and music lovers materialized around the Crossroads to witness the birth of a new form of artistic expression that transcended the normal boundaries between life and death. The music that emerged from this supernatural collaboration was unlike anything that had ever been heard before, combining the rhythmic complexity of African traditions with the harmonic sophistication of European classical music and the emotional intensity of American blues and spirituals. This fusion created a sound that would later be recognized as the birth of jazz music, though its supernatural origins would be hidden from all but a few initiates who understood the true price that had been paid for its creation. The Music Man's final gift to the 17 musicians was the knowledge that their supernatural abilities would be passed down to future generations through the music itself, as anyone who truly understood and mastered the new musical form would gain access to a portion of the power that had been purchased with their souls. This meant that jazz music would always carry within it a supernatural element that could transform both performers and listeners in ways that transcended normal artistic experience. However, the Music Man also revealed the curse that would accompany this gift. The 17 musicians would be compelled to spread their supernatural music throughout the world, but they would never be able to find true peace or satisfaction in their performances. They would be driven by an insatiable hunger for musical perfection that could never be fully satisfied, and their enhanced abilities would come at the cost of their mental and physical health. The immediate effects of the supernatural transformation were evident in the months following the Crossroads gathering, as each of the 17 musicians began to display abilities that exceeded anything they had previously demonstrated. Jelly Roll Morton's piano playing became so emotionally powerful that listeners reported experiencing visions and spiritual revelations during his performances, while Buddy Bolden's cornet could allegedly cure illnesses and drive listeners into states of religious ecstasy. Sidney Bechet's clarinet playing began to incorporate techniques and musical concepts that seemed to come from sources beyond human knowledge, while King Oliver's innovative use of mutes and special effects created sounds that defied conventional understanding of what brass instruments could produce. The other 13 musicians similarly displayed enhanced abilities that marked them as fundamentally different from ordinary performers. The supernatural music created by these enhanced musicians began to spread throughout New Orleans and beyond, carried by other performers who learned the new techniques and incorporated them into their own playing. However, those who attempted to replicate the supernatural music without understanding its true origins often found themselves experiencing strange phenomena, including vivid dreams, supernatural visitations, and compulsions to seek out the original 17 musicians for further instruction. The psychological cost of their supernatural abilities became apparent as the years passed, as several of the 17 musicians began to display signs of mental instability that seemed to be connected to their enhanced musical powers. Buddy Bolden, in particular, began to suffer from episodes of madness that were characterized by claims that he could hear the voices of the dead speaking through his music, and that his cornet was possessed by spirits who demanded increasingly extreme performances. The physical toll of channeling supernatural musical energy also became evident, as many of the musicians aged rapidly and suffered from health problems that seemed to be related to the otherworldly forces flowing through their bodies. Their instruments themselves began to show signs of supernatural influence, with some developing unusual acoustic properties and others requiring special care to prevent them from producing sounds that could be dangerous to listeners. The Music Man's influence on the 17 musicians extended beyond their individual performances to encompass their relationships with each other and with the broader musical community. They found themselves bound together by supernatural forces that compelled them to collaborate on musical projects that served the Music Man's mysterious purposes, even when such collaboration conflicted with their personal desires or professional interests. The secret knowledge that the 17 musicians possessed about the supernatural origins of jazz music created a hidden tradition within the musical community, as they carefully selected students and protégés who could be trusted with the truth about the Crossroads bargain. These initiates formed a secret society that worked to preserve and transmit the supernatural musical techniques while also protecting the broader community from the more dangerous aspects of the Music Man's influence. The impact of the supernatural music on New Orleans culture was profound and far-reaching, as the new musical form began to influence not only entertainment but also religious practices, social gatherings, and even political movements. The emotional power of jazz music made it an effective tool for community organizing and cultural resistance, while its supernatural elements provided spiritual comfort to people who had been denied access to other forms of transcendent experience. The spread of jazz music beyond New Orleans carried with it the supernatural influences that had been embedded in its creation, as musicians throughout America and eventually the world began to experience phenomena that suggested they were tapping into the same otherworldly sources of inspiration that had empowered the original 17. This global expansion of supernatural musical influence represented the fulfillment of the Music Man's plan to use human artists as conduits for his power. The Catholic Church's response to the emergence of jazz music was complicated by the obvious spiritual power that the music contained, as church officials struggled to determine whether its effects were divine or demonic in origin. Some priests argued that music capable of producing healing and spiritual transformation must be blessed by God, while others maintained that its supernatural origins made it inherently dangerous to Christian souls. The theological debate was further complicated by reports that jazz music had been used successfully in exorcism rituals and other forms of spiritual warfare, suggesting that its power could be directed toward either good or evil purposes depending on the intentions of the performer. This moral ambiguity made it difficult for religious authorities to take a definitive stance on whether jazz music should be encouraged or condemned. The medical community's interest in the healing properties of jazz music led to early experiments in what would later be called music therapy, as doctors began to document cases where exposure to certain types of jazz performances had produced measurable improvements in patients suffering from various physical and mental ailments. However, These same researchers also noted that some forms of jazz music seem to have negative effects on certain individuals, suggesting that its supernatural power could be dangerous as well as beneficial. The academic study of jazz music was complicated by the fact that its most essential elements seemed to resist conventional musical analysis, as the supernatural techniques used by the original 17 musicians could not be fully understood through traditional musicological methods. Scholars who attempted to document and categorize jazz music often found themselves experiencing phenomena that suggested they were encountering forces that operated beyond the normal boundaries of academic inquiry. The commercial success of jazz music created new economic opportunities for African American musicians, but it also led to exploitation by record companies and entertainment venues that sought to profit from the supernatural musical power without understanding or respecting its origins. The 17 original musicians found themselves caught between their desire to share their gift with the world and their need to protect the sacred knowledge that had been entrusted to them. The political implications of jazz music's supernatural power were recognized by both supporters and opponents of racial equality, as the music's ability to transcend cultural barriers and create emotional connections between people of different backgrounds made it a powerful tool for social change. However, this same power also made jazz music a target for those who sought to maintain existing racial hierarchies and social divisions. The international spread of jazz music during the early 20th century carried the supernatural influences of the Crossroads bargain to every continent, as musicians around the world began to experience the same phenomena that had characterized the original 17. This global expansion of supernatural musical influence created a worldwide network of artists who were unknowingly serving the music man's purposes through their performances. The development of recording technology created new challenges for the preservation and transmission of supernatural musical power, as the 17 musicians discovered that their enhanced abilities could not be fully captured by mechanical reproduction methods. This limitation meant that the most powerful aspects of their music could only be experienced through live performance, creating a distinction between recorded and live jazz that continues to influence the musical form today. The emergence of different styles and schools of jazz music reflected the various ways that musicians interpreted and channeled the supernatural power that had been embedded in the musical form's origins. Some performers focused on the healing and spiritual aspects of the music, while others explored its potential for emotional manipulation and psychological influence. The tragic fate of Buddy Bolden, who spent his final years in a mental institution claiming that his music was controlled by demonic forces, served as a warning about the potential dangers of channeling supernatural musical power without proper understanding and protection. His descent into madness became a cautionary tale within the secret tradition maintained by the surviving members of the original 17 that the deaths of the original 17 musicians were marked by supernatural phenomena that confirmed the reality of their bargain with the music man, as each passing was accompanied by strange musical manifestations and reports of ghostly performances that continued long after the physical bodies had been laid to rest. These posthumous appearances suggested that their souls had indeed been claimed by the supernatural entity and were continuing to serve his purposes in the afterlife. The legacy of the 17 musicians continues to influence jazz music today, as contemporary performers still report experiencing supernatural phenomena when they achieve certain levels of mastery in the musical form. These experiences suggest that the Crossroads bargain created a permanent connection between jazz music and otherworldly sources of power that remains active more than a century after the original agreement was made. Modern researchers studying the supernatural aspects of jazz music have documented numerous cases of musicians who claim to have received instruction from the spirits of the original 17, suggesting that their influence continues to shape the development of the musical form. These spiritual encounters often occur at crossroads or other locations that are considered sacred in various musical traditions. The psychological and sociological impact of jazz music's supernatural origins has been studied by researchers interested in the relationship between artistic inspiration and altered states of consciousness. These studies have revealed patterns of experience among jazz musicians that suggest they are tapping into sources of creativity that operate beyond normal cognitive processes. Contemporary discussions of the Crossroads bargain often focus on its relevance to ongoing debates about the relationship between artistic achievement and personal sacrifice, as the story provides a framework for understanding how the pursuit of creative excellence can come at the cost of individual well-being. The tale serves as a metaphor for the challenges faced by artists who seek to transcend conventional limitations while maintaining their humanity. the influence of the 17 musicians on the development of American popular music extends far beyond jazz to encompass blues, rock and roll, and other musical forms that have incorporated elements of the supernatural musical techniques that were first demonstrated at the Tremé Crossroads. This ongoing influence suggests that the Music Man's plan to transform human musical expression has been remarkably successful. As we approach the 136th anniversary of the Crossroads gathering, the story of the 17 musicians continues to resonate with contemporary artists who recognize the ongoing relevance of questions about the relationship between talent and sacrifice, inspiration and damnation. The Crossroads in Tremé remains a pilgrimage site for musicians seeking to understand the supernatural origins of the musical form that has become America's greatest cultural export. The music that was born from the supernatural bargain continues to evolve and spread throughout the world, carrying with it the spiritual power that was purchased with 17 souls on that Halloween night in 1888. Each new generation of jazz musicians must decide for themselves how much they are willing to sacrifice for the opportunity to channel the otherworldly forces that flow through the music they have inherited. If this haunting tale of musical damnation and supernatural artistry has left you questioning the true price of creative excellence and the forces that drive human artistic achievement, please show your support by hitting that like button. Your engagement helps us continue to explore these profound mysteries where talent meets temptation and where the pursuit of perfection leads to realms beyond human understanding. And if you haven't already joined our community of musical mystics here at Bayou Nightmares, make sure to subscribe to our channel that we delve deep into the supernatural origins of American music every week, bringing you stories of crossroads bargains, possessed instruments, and the eternal struggle between artistic inspiration and spiritual damnation. From the jazz clubs of New Orleans to the hidden crossroads where souls are traded for songs, we explore the mysteries that remind us that some music carries more than melody, it carries the power to transform both performer and listener in ways that transcend earthly understanding. It's important to remember that while the stories we share on Bayou Nightmares are carefully researched and often based on historical accounts, they are presented as entertainment and educational content. Some elements may be dramatized or interpreted through the lens of folklore and legend, though they are frequently inspired by real experiences of musical transcendence and the ongoing human struggle to balance artistic achievement with spiritual well-being. Until we meet again at the crossroads where music and magic converge, keep listening for the supernatural harmonies that echo through every note, keep questioning the true source of artistic inspiration, and remember that some songs carry within them the power to move heaven and earth, but always at a price that extends far beyond what the ear can hear. This has been Bayou Nightmares, where music is magic, crossroads are sacred, and every song tells a story of souls seeking perfection in a world where the devil has all the best tunes.